Joe, the CEO and founder of LILA Movement Technology and the creator of the EXOGEN technology. We're here to welcome you again to our LILA monthly webinar series. This month, another exciting topic with very elite level speakers. We're going to be talking about EXOGEN wearable resistance in basketball, and the specific topic today is thinking back from the game. Looking at the game and what's needed to win and perform, and looking at conditioning and how we can use technology to help improve that, rather than just think of building an athlete and somehow sticking them in the game. So stay tuned, because we've got great speakers as usual. Our science section is going to be covered by Dr. John Cronin. He is the head of research for LILA, and as you know, the head of research and department there at AUT High Performance Sports Research Institute, New Zealand. And we're very excited to have Carl Bergstrom. Carl is the head performance coach for the Golden State Warriors. He's going to be filling you in a lot of the detail on what they're starting to experiment and explore with there. So stay tuned. Please share this with your friends, your coaches, and anybody else who you think might find value. And let's get started. So welcome to my section, which is an introduction to wearable resistance specifically for the game of basketball. We like the topic called Thinking Back from the Game. It was actually a topic title that Carl came up with, because we want to focus on the game. We don't want to try and focus on just general training and building an athlete and then somehow hoping that helps a basketball player. We're going to look at the game of basketball and what's needed at the high level and deconstruct from there. So that's the concept of today's presentation. Some of the things we're going to talk about, I'm going to go through is, again, how specific is speed and technique, and how does that affect things like transference? What is an NBA action? I'm planting that thought in your head because that's come up now in several of these very high-level webinars we've done with the Minnesota Vikings and the NFL, with elite sprinting, with USA Track and Field, with cricket and UK cricket fast bowling, and now the NBA. An NBA action is a very specific motion, and it's the best players in the world know what NBA actions are. And there's a difference between an NBA action and a basketball action and an athletic action. And we're going to get into that as we talk, and talk about how transference is really dependent on us, or you as a coach, understanding these things. And of course, the big topic, transference. As always, a little brief history on resistance training, weight training. As you've seen, if you've seen these presentations before, I'm going to move through this pretty quick. Back in the 50s, you know, we were all focused on calisthenics. We used body weight and gymnastics equipment, and the mindset on people was not on elite performance, it was on building a healthy citizenship. This is post-war era. Body weight was our resistance. As the 50s to 70s rolled around, we started getting into weight training, two kinds of weight training, mostly around free weights, but there was the bodybuilding mindset with free weights, and then the Olympic lifting mindset and powerlifting mindset, the sport and the beauty of it. But it was all based on the resistance being free weights. In the 70s and 80s, the machine world came around, and machines were developed not to develop performance, not to improve the body. They were developed to sell free weight type exercises easily to a large population. And again, mindset was now on lifestyle. The gym was a healthy choice, but resistance was becoming a weight stack. 90s and 2000s, things started getting mixed. We started seeing a combination, if anybody, and I've been through pretty much all these stages except for the 50s to 70s. Machines and free weights were very much a part of any strength coach's training. But one thing that's sure is the 90s and 2000s, 1RM was king. All of us, 99% of us, were jamming the 1RM down the throat of pretty much every athlete. If you were a swimmer, you were doing 1RM training. If you were a gymnast, you were doing 1RM training. If you were a polo player, somebody was worried about your 1RM. Now, I'm not saying everybody was. Don't get your, bun in a knot. But literally, we were focused on 1RM, and heavy weight training was our solution for everything. And that's changing, of course, now. Current day, new generation, some of the older guys were thinking a little different too, and that is the body weight's important again. Movement's important, function's important. And we're looking at resistance training very differently than we did before. The bar is no longer the primary tool in the toolbox. It's still a tool, but it's no longer the solution for everything. And we're really starting to understand this concept of movements and performance and transference at a much higher level. Why is that important? History important? As always, I say, As a strength coach, as a performance coach, whoever you are, you have to know and understand your tools. You have to know why they're in that box, and you have to know when and where to use them. And a lot of the tools in our box as performance coaches were not designed to optimize human performance. We ended up with them. No strength coach developed the leg press and said, this is how you develop sprinters. A leg press was developed by a guy trying to sell fitness equipment to a club, and our strength coaches went in and saw it and tried to adapt it into sprinting. So it wasn't created for us. So what does the future look like for equipment? Well, hopefully we're going to continue to shed light on that and talk about wearable resistance as part of that solution. Traditional versus wearable resistance. TRT is something we sort of were focused on, and that is traditional resistance training is basically everything we just described. Number one, it utilizes external equipment, okay? The focus is generally on lifting or moving or accelerating a near or maximal external load, and the outcome is generally to overload the neuromuscular system for some level of adaptation to maximal high levels of strength, hypertrophy, or power. And you see there on the screen a multitude of different types of equipment that generally use traditional resistance training methods. Number one thing is everything there is external, okay? And that's a really important point as we talk about movement. Now the benefits of it, again, just have a quick review. Of course, you can load heavy and stimulate high levels of hormone. If your sport needs high levels of that, or if you need that as an athlete, then you're going to need some level of TRT in your sport. You definitely can build moderate to high levels of strength, power, and mass. So if you're an NFL player, a rugby player, a college player trying to build some weight, guess what? You're going to be doing some TRT. It can definitely contribute to speed, agility, and COD, change of direction, and other movements in certain athletes. Some maybe not so much, but again, it has value there. And it's fairly simple to use. 30 years ago, we were trying to teach people how to do power cleans. Now your average housewife who's gone to a CrossFit box knows how to do them. But there are limitations as well. Movements are equipment defined. They're not user defined. That is a critical concept. You're going to hear me say it every webinar we have. It's something important to understand. Focus is still often on maximal, not optimal loading. It will alter movement patterns and kinematics. It's performed in a gym setting. It's hard to move a squat rack out to a swimming pool or a squash court. Progressions are generally large and often too heavy to achieve specific speed. This is something JC is going to get into on the specificity of speed and force and the force velocity curve. And transfers to specific movement and competition is often very limited. So that question again, what is transference? How specific is it? We're going to take a quick look. My favorite slide, it's always there. Here we go. There is a ton of equipment on the screen there for golf to improve the golf swing. The reason I choose golf is just one of the most specific fine-tuned motor skill sports out there. And we've got all this resistance equipment that is being sold and used, may or may not have value. That's not the point of this presentation. But there's something wrong with this picture. Two things missing. And if you've done any work in this sport, you realize nobody's holding a golf club and nobody's on a golf course. So how specific are these? As compared to this. Now this is Danny Chia. Danny Chia is one of our pro golfers. He's a former PGA Tour golfer. He's won PGA Tour tournaments, the first Asian to win a pro PGA Tour. And we're looking at helping him right now come back for the Masters Series in Japan. He's loaded with an EXOGEN top. He's got specific loading. You'll see the green arrows here. He's got assistive and resistive loading for his lower back issues. So this is lower back transference, rotational issues specific to his sport. And guess what? He's on the course and he's holding his clubs. So he's not holding a weighted stick. He's holding his club. He's focusing on the shot accuracy. He's focusing on the speed, the rotation, but at the same time, we're working the specific issue. And again, just compare that to the picture before and after. See those arrows there. Specificity and transference. Let's keep going. So how much load is too much? Again, we've started adding this in there. We've done a lot of work with sports and programs around the world. As you know, with wearable resistance, our loading starts as little as 50 grams, can go up to about 10% of body weight. But here's an example again that I used last time, and it's really poignant in how it emphasizes just how specific not only speed is, but transference and elite performance. This is, so just watch. That is a
I want to see if it slides. It's okay if it slides for us.
In the world. He's now retired since then. This is almost 10 years ago. He's loaded with 400 grams on his arm. And we're going to talk about that short and range motion. What we're seeing here, another Asian level champion. They're focusing on a very specific punch. If you can't see that punch, don't worry. Most people can't. The fastest speeds possible. He's loaded with 400 grams on each arm as well. Okay.
You went straight below the belt there.
Just going to go
low
back.
blow.
Sorry, we're going to go forward here. So now what we're going to look at here is I want you to think about what was happening. Hopefully you can see this image. You may have seen it for the video or not. Don't worry. You can view this again if you want to catch the detail, but I'll explain it to you. So we're working with these guys on speed. Fastest speeds possible. We have 400 grams loaded on the arm. We've gone through a series of loading. 50, 100, 200, 300, 400 grams. And the coach and us, what we were doing at this time is we were recording on video to look at changes in technique with loading. So for all you out there who have ever worked with a combat sport athlete and put a dumbbell in their hand or a tubing in their hand or a cable in their hand or something that we called specific, let's take a look at how specific weight is in high speed movement. And these guys move at the fastest speeds possible. So the same thing's going to apply to leg speed, foot speed, change of direction, whatever you're going to talk about. In that first punch, what he's trying to do, he's loaded. When we put 100 grams on that arm, we saw no change in his technique. The second set with 200 grams on the arm, 100 here, 102, and that's 100 here. So that's about 8 ounces. We started to see the athlete working and being not compromised, but having to put effort in, but he could still manage technique. 3, now they were working at a very high intense level. You know, an RP of 8 or 9 for that movement. By 400 grams, that's 1 pound dispersed across the entire arm and not held in the hand, technique was already changed negatively. And this is the technique change we saw from 400 grams. Okay, so when 400 grams was placed on the arm, this line here, as you see, that was the resultant range of motion. It was no longer full extension, which is critical, because if you have an arm here, you didn't make contact. If you don't make contact in full kumite karate, you don't get the point. This to that. And this is the line we were looking for, okay? And we saw this line change to the white line as he approached 300 to 400 grams. 100 to 200 grams, didn't change that. He was still able to maintain that. And because now his arm's starting to pull back early, he's protecting his shoulder from injury at high speed. So just think of the specificity of loading in high-speed movements. Now, we haven't had tools that allowed this before, and that's one of the coolest things about EXOGEN, because we can load in such micro amounts. So what we realized very quickly is 100 to 200 grams is a training load for the fastest arm speeds possible. And that's now in our training guidelines. Now let's take a look at another one here. Yeah, ultimately just what the difference in that green circle, that's the difference between a world champion #1 and a world number 10. That's a guy who's going home in the first round. Oh, there's, all right, so now take a look at what was happening in the second case. The white arrow was the line he was on. As he got to higher weight, instead of punching out straight, the arm was dropping. It was coming down. The weight, that 400 grams at very high speed, was dropping that range of motion. So now, it's not that he was short, he was off target. These guys spend their whole life trying to hit that specific target because that's the scoring point, and that's the difference between elite sport and amateur sport. And that change with 400 grams, this was a real eye-opener for us. So the reason I'm explaining this to you is just, we never understood, till now, really, how little load makes a difference in real sport movement, because our tools in our toolbox were filled with big loads and external loads and clumsy loads and tools that changed movement. But we have something now that allows us to actually affect real skill and competitive change. But we have to really understand how much is a lot. And as we know right now, 50 or 100 grams in high speed movement is a load. What is wearable resistance? Simple. It applies very directly to the body via a piece of clothing or garment to which the weight is applied. It's used, again, most critical thing, it's used primarily during your actual sport or competition setting. I've already showed you a couple of videos of a golfer and martial artist. They weren't in the gym, they weren't attached to a machine, they were in full competitive practice situations or real game situations. And in the golfer's case, he was actually swinging his real club. And that's why we'd say transference is direct, because you're not in this setting trying to create something over here in this setting. The focus, the mindset, the competition, the real conditions that are related to what the athlete's going to experience in competition are part of that environment. And if we're going to move forward, we've got to get better at that. As we always say, change what you wear, not what you do. Wearable resistance isn't new. It's been around a while. Weighted vests, ankle weights, wrist weights. You know, there's a lot of different modes that have been there. Most of them to this day, we're trying to transfer heavy weight onto the body. And that's kind of been the mistake, I think, or the error or illusion. And one of the reasons why we spent almost 17 years working on this is we wanted to understand this before we brought it out. Some of the general guidelines we have with wearable resistance. First off, the equipment does not define the range of motion, the user does. In those karate examples, once the load got too heavy, the load was starting to affect performance. So guess what you should do in that situation? Unload. If they can't control technique, it's too heavy. You generally use just in 10% of your body weight. Progressions are in grams and ounces. Again, those progressions were 4, 8, 12 ounce, or 100, 200, 300 grams. Movement speeds must be able to remain at or near competition speeds. Anybody who's been a speed coach tells you if you're not training at speed, you're not getting faster. Minimal or no disruption to skill. One of the things we've proven pretty much with consistency and without argument anymore is that light resistance in the right places on the body will not affect technique poorly, and in fact can enhance it. Hands and feet have to be free. You've heard me say that constantly. The most sensitive areas of the body can't be holding cables or bars or something foreign to the mind of the person in that activity. You use it in your actual sport. Transference is direct and critical here. It does not replace the adaptations of traditional resistance training. If you're trying to build muscle mass, you're not going to get it with 500 grams of wearable resistance. Some of our key laws of training in wearable resistance in terms of individualization. Number one, if it feels wrong, you reload it. You just move the position. You will always find the place where the load accentuates and helps and is doing its job, and there's other areas where it's not. What we do with the athlete is the loading amount we guide as the performance coach, the position on the body, they guide. So you can have 5 athletes all wearing calf sleeves. I tell them we're all working with 400 grams today. We're going to be doing change of direction work. I let them choose the position because they've learned it. They know what their weakness is. Some will be on the inside of the calf, some will be the outside. I'm not going to, if I dictate that to them, I'm completely ignoring the fact that they know what feelings they need to produce. They know their body. So again, I choose the amount, they choose the position. And that makes this one of the first communication resistance tool and coaching tool that we probably had. You got to listen to the athlete. Specificity, reduce the load, not the speed or the movement quality. Back to that karate example. Those guys are punching. Don't turn this into another heavy load. Anybody can make somebody sweat. That's not the purpose. If we're reducing movement quality in transference training, we've lost the whole boat. If we're reducing speed, we're missing the picture. So make sure the movement is challenged but not compromised. And that's a quality thing you pick up very quickly. Progressive overload, we've got what we call our over-under rule. Over 70 kilos, under 70 kilos. Over 150 pounds, under 150 pounds. And the next level is over 220. But we've seen that. Generally 100 grams in 1 to 2 weeks or 200 grams for limb loading is a good progression. And 200 to 400 grams for body loading, because the bigger center of mass pieces obviously can handle a greater load, are good progressions. So that is 4 to 8 ounces or 8 to 16 ounces. So that's half a pound or a pound is a progression in 2 weeks, not kilos. You're never going to start with a pound and go to 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 unless you're doing a very general specific CrossFit home workout. But that's not what we're talking about today. And of course, with overtraining, listen to your body. A light load moving at high speed can be as stressful load in the body as a heavy load moving slowly. JC is going to get into the detail of that, and it's incredible how much a small load moving around really affects output. And some of the acute chronic variables we've already learned. 20 to 30 minute loading sessions seem to be ideal. 2 to 3 times a week, again, you need that 48 hours recovery. Uploading every 1 to 2 weeks, downloading every 5 to 6 weeks, maintain moving quality and speed. So a lot of traditional resistance training periodization rules still apply because it's still resistance training. Our EXOGEN wearable resistance suit, as you've seen, if you've looked at the website, it's a full body suit, which has a bunch of different components. And again, something I'll tell you as well, you need the piece for your sport. You don't need the whole suit. If you're working on footwork, guess what? You're wearing calf sleeves. If you're working on hand speed, guess what? You're wearing forearm sleeves. Kit comes complete with all the loads. The loads range from 50, 100, 200 to 300 grams. There's a reason for that. And those 50s are important. Now again, talking a little bit about the biomechanics and the science that's gone into the suit. Those loads have an abelian insertion point. The belly is the heavy part, the insertion is the lighter part. That gives us the ability to disperse the load and balance the load around the body. If it was just a solid chunk, and we tried that. We tried over 100, 150 different designs of load. A solid chunk becomes a focal point. It becomes like a dumbbell, even you put on the elbow. Where the belly goes, the movement goes. It's like a wheel balancing weight. This is the scenario we use. You get a body moving. Remember, all movement's rotational. So a leg moving through a high-speed cycle, an arm, that's a series of rotations. In a punch, a throw, that's a series of rotation. A cut, it's a series of rotations. When the body rotates, moves fast. A small weight in the right position can put that whole body into balance and create an ideal situation. Just like a 5-gram weight, a 5 to 10, 20 grams of weight on a 30-kilo tire. That tire's spinning at X amount of RPM. That small weight in that position makes all the difference to fuel performance, economy, safety, you name it. And this is what EXOGEN is. We're fine-tuning movement and creating perfect balance situations that can accentuate the athlete's experience in their competition. So we've got 6 base loading profiles, what we call proximal and distal, and that's where the belly is either near the rotating joint or away from the rotating joint, and it changes things significantly. As you know, when it's near the rotating joint, it's going to feel lighter because of your movement lever systems. When it's distal, it's going to feel heavier. A load here feels heavier than here. Posterior and anterior, loading on the back of the arm and the front of the arm. Again, complete difference in the muscles that are working during movement. One, you'll feel the posterior chain, that muscle's working. The other one, the anterior chain. And the last one is the fun stuff with the rotations when you load internal, across the body, or external, outside the body. And that changes everything. So if you're looking at a basketball shot, young athletes, a lot of them, they want to get that elbow in. A lot of people shoot like this. We can put a small load on the inside of the arm, put that belly to the inside of the arm. It will, by gravity and inertia, momentum, it's going to pull that elbow in. It's going to help them keep that clear. And this where I was saying about tweaking. One of the things with EXOGEN that's most exciting to me, it's a coaching tool. If you just want to add weight to the body and make somebody work harder, we can do that. So let's talk a little bit about loading for basketball. And this is where I just mentioned. There's general loading for basketball, for any sport. Speed, lower body, you work on things like footwork, agility, acceleration, change of direction, jumping. That's where you get into some calf sleeves and shorts. The legs feed the wolf, so load them directly. And in the upper body, when we get into our full arm sleeves and our tops, look at ball handling, shot range, okay? Increasing shot range just because of specific strength. Everybody knows it's a full body mechanic, but we've actually looked at athletes increasing that from a 2 to a 3-point range with a specific movement. And controlling traffic. As you know, a lot of athletes aren't so strong on the ball. They can get bumps off the ball easy. Arm can get disturbed easy. Creating strength so they're strong in traffic as in body contact. It's a really critical specificity, but it's still a general issue. The other one is game endurance. Just working on anaerobic and aerobic fitness, whatever term you want to use. I use short and long term. Here's an example. Now this is loaded, so he's a national member and a high level elite amateur player. He's got 1% of body weight. 10 shots, 60 seconds, 10 sets, about 30 seconds rest, loaded with balanced loading. So this is just conditioning, putting the weight into real movements of the game for specific endurance. And of course, specific speed, everything is being challenged. Then the next session, look how tired he gets, how quickly he gets tired. You can see just showing you 1 to 4%, that's about a kilo up to about 3-4 kilos. Small changes make a big difference. Now, again, loading for basketball, same sort of thing in a conditioning drill. This is Eric Butler, former athlete of mine, CIU All-Star, top 5'10" player in Canada. He played European Pro for 8 to 10 years now, runs split-second basketball. Go ahead, we can run that. And again, he's loaded specifically.
After the first warm-up sequence, get those shorts all dialed in. Still 3.2 kilos of load. And I'm going to give Eric 1 minute. Random shooting, whatever he wants to throw out, and I got your time. Go at it. Good boy. Nice. Fade away. Excellent. You got about 30 seconds. Nice bucket.
And the last one, again, is Eric, just unloaded. Now he's moving through.
I want you to think kinesthetically. What does this feel like? Flush out period of 4 minutes. Nice. Good. Good.
Put the conditioning in, and let's talk a little bit about specific basketball actions. Wearable resistance can be like any resistance. You can add to the body to make effort harder. Whatever effort you're trying to do, but we can do it in a very specific situation, which makes it specific endurance. But specific actions is where we get into the good stuff, and Carl's going to talk a little bit about this. What we call a basketball action versus an athletic action. We're going to talk a little, just look at a couple examples of a position-specific training and a player-specific training. And last thing I'll talk to you about is flow. So this is an athletic action. This exogen, not on a basketball player. I think this is an NHL guy. One of our NHL guys just got calf sleeves, and he's working on, there you go, lateral movement drills. This is summer dryland training while he comes back from the league. I can't show you who it is. Obviously, he's the biggest player in the entire league. Maybe not. This is captain of the women's all black. Athletic action, drills, basic condition. These are
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, fast.
General. Those are athletic actions. Just and stop there. So you can train specific athletic actions like a lateral movement, like a change of direction, but an athletic action is not an NBA action or a basketball action until you're on the court and until you're creating an outcome that is specific to the game. It means there's a shot in there. It means you're going to beat a player. It means you're going to be in a specific position. Maybe you're going to catch a rebound. That's when we move away from what we call athletic actions into basketball actions, and then from basketball actions into NBA actions. Because if you know pro sport, the actions in a pro sport situation are often very different than the amateur level, like boxing, like martial arts, like basketball. We're gonna talk a little bit about what are NBA actions compared to just basketball actions. Next slide. So now we're gonna talk about basketball actions, not necessarily NBA, but basketball, high-level basketball actions. And this is a position or a movement-specific action. What we're working on here is the drive, leg drive. So when that body comes up and that leg comes up with that drive, it's a very specific need, and some athletes are good at it, some aren't, for a number of reasons, whether it's to create impact, whether it's to clear the way through the leg, whether it's to increase force. And what we're doing here is we've loaded with the belly down, so it pulls the leg down, so he has to work on his hip flexors as he comes up for that layup to drive up. It's a very specific ability to work a movement action in basketball.
On the lateral cut, they're going to try and pull him sideways. When he goes up and drives the leg up, just hike the leg up for a second, those loads are going straight down. So when he's going in for his layup, jump shot, whatever it is, a sprint, that knee comes up, the loads are resisting that particular action. Does that make sense? It's a whole new freaking lesson in kinematics. And this has been so much fun for me as a trainer to actually work with this stuff, because it's as vague as you want to make it, but it's also as fine-tuned as you want to make it. We'll now do that.
Now, that's a movement-specific action, it can be to any player. But here's what we call a player-specific training, or a basketball action. This is moving from a strong side to a weak side loading. Eric is specifically loaded with the loads on one side of the body. We've loaded him to his strong side, which means it's going to assist the strong side. So when he goes to all that loads here, when he goes to his right, which is his strong side, that load's going to assist him. But his weak side is his left side. So all that loads here on the right has to be turned over to the left, and the left side's got to work hard. And if you pick up subtleties of movement, if you worked in elite sport, you're going to see he's going to come to the right, very easy, soft. The shot release is going to be nice. When you see him do it to the left, you're going to see the awkwardness because he can't rotate his body the same way, and he has to work against that. And that's a specific weakness he has. Right?
Boom, he pops up for a shot, and he drained it. See it?
Weak side loading. Now watch that right before he shoots. Watch the awkward position of his body. We can do it again. Yeah, do that. Just let it play. Watch it. A little slowness. Just let it
You guys see the mechanics of what he's actually trying to have to overcome? Does that all make sense to you? So I can resist the...
What we're doing now with the loading for a player-specific action, and you know this, guys know you're strong right or you're strong left. When you work at a pro level, these guys know each other very well. He can't go to his left. I know he's going to take that extra step. I know if I pressure him because he's weak on the left, he's going to fall back or he's going to be unbalanced. We can target that now. And this is one of the exciting things about wearable resistance is once you've got that base strength from your TRT, you can start putting it into your athletic actions, your basketball actions, and at the pro level, your NBA or your NFL or your UFC actions. We're going to stop there. We're going to get into the question and answer period afterwards. I'll come back from that. Now we're going to move straight to JC. He's going to walk in the science of wearable resistance in basketball. So stay tuned. I'll catch up with you at the end for Q&A.
Hi, welcome to part 2 of this webinar. I'm John Cronin, a professor in strength and conditioning at AUT University and also head of research for LILA. In this session today, I would like to share with you some information around the mechanics, why wearable resistance works. Then I would like to share the applications that we can have or we can use wearable resistance for change of direction, training, jumping. I would like to share some information about why we think it's so good for optimizing transference and as a very good option for addressing the limitations of congested schedules. Thereafter, I would just like to share you some of the research we're up to. So why does it work? Well, one of the big reasons it works is if you can just remember this formula here, force equals mass times acceleration. Most of us are interested in developing the force capability or strength of athletes. So therefore, what we do in traditional strength training is actually put large loads on bars or large masses, and then we ask the athlete to overcome these large masses. And as a result, the movement velocity or the acceleration, movement velocities and accelerations are small. So in this type of resistance strength training, it's mass centric or load centric. So the masses are large and the movement velocities are small. What wearable resistance does, it just flips the model here. We use light loads or light masses. You can see on this athlete on the right, he has 600 grams of load on each thigh. So light variable resistance training or wearable resistance flips the model and we have high velocity force capability rather than mass centric force capability. So remember that it's a real paradigm shift, but we can actually develop force capability in athletes in very different ways. I'd like to talk to you about these three loading parameters. There are a little bit of physics in them again, but these are the three loading parameters we use when we actually think about loading with wearable resistance. And if you understand them, you'll understand how to load with wearable resistance. The first concept I want to talk to you about is inertia. Inertia is the resistance to change in motion. Now, that inertia is affected by mass. As soon as we put mass on somebody, they become heavier. And as a result, it is harder for them to move themselves, whether it be vertically or horizontally. And we can see there in the picture again, we've got 300 grams of additional mass on his thighs. So we've increased the inertia. His thighs become harder to move. There's greater resistance to change in motion. So one of the first things how you can actually overload athletes is by changing their inertia. In changing their inertia, we actually change their momentum. There is the formula for momentum. Momentum equals mass times velocity. So by placing additional mass on the athletes, we actually increase their momentum. And the importance of this will become apparent when we start talking about change of direction. As long as the velocity stays pretty much the same, when we increase the mass, we increase the momentum. And this can be vertical or horizontal. So wearable resistance increases momentum by increasing mass. And this can have some interesting movement effects, which we'll explore a little bit later. The second concept of loading with wearable resistance is built around this term here called rotational inertia. Right, there is the formula for rotational inertia, I equals mr squared. You can still see it as a function of mass. So you can actually put mass on the limb and it becomes heavier. And so therefore you actually increase its inertia. However, it's also about the distribution of the mass away from the axis of rotation. You can see the little X here, that's the hip joint here, that's the axis of rotation. And we've placed this 200 gram load 20 centimeters away from the axis of rotation. So that 20 would be entered into this formula here. By shifting the mass down 10 centimeters, that means it's 30 centimeters away from the axis of rotation, and that 30 gets introduced into the formula. So the same load shifted 10 centimeters down has greater rotational inertia, and therefore it's harder for the thigh or the thigh musculature or the muscles across the hip to actually accelerate the limb and decelerate the limb, and so on and so forth down here. We have a load down the bottom here, which we call a distal load. That is 50 centimeters away from the axis of rotation. And so that's providing a substantial overload. It's the same load, it's the same 200 grams, but because we're playing around with this R, playing around with the distance from the axis of rotation, we are increasing the rotational inertia. How much? Well, if we overload the thigh by shifting it down 30 centimeters, it's 4.7% harder to accelerate and decelerate the limb. If we shift it down 50 centimeters, it's 12.1%. So that is a substantial overload. So this concept of rotational inertia is a very important one to think about when we're overloading with wearable resistance. The next loading parameter is all about velocity of movement, and we explore the work-energy relationship here. And the work-energy relationship is simply saying that the muscular work that you produce equals the energy associated with the exercise, or conversely, the energy associated with the exercise produces the muscular, or is responsible for the muscular work. So let's have a look at the muscular work around the hip here. In this top diagram, I've got a guy lifting 100 kgs. This is all the maths behind it. It's the kinetic energy. Here's the formula, half mv squared. The kinetic energy, because both these exercises don't have a net change in height, we don't have to calculate the potential energy. So here is the formula for 100 kgs. This is the velocity you can actually move one of these loads at. And we work out that this is most probably the kinetic energy, and therefore the work that is associated with moving this bar. Now let's take sprinting. And all we have to do is put 1 kg on this sprinter here, 500 grams on each thigh, and then multiply it by the typical velocity of movement associated with sprinting. And this is not a top end sprinter. This is middle road of sprinting velocities here. As we see, when we start multiplying it all out, that the kinetic energy associated with moving a half a kg load very quickly is pretty much the same as moving 100 kgs very slowly. So the thing that we got to be aware of here is that we can produce a lot of muscular work by moving a light load very quickly. And we all know that if we actually we do some drills at 50% of Vmax, 70% of Vmax, and then 90% of Vmax, the actually energy requirements are very different, and the muscular and metabolic work requirements are very important. So those are the three loading parameters. Now let's just have a look at what type of overload wearable resistance produces. We can wear vests to provide a vertical overload or a vertical downward momentum. We can also load the limbs. We can also load the limbs to produce a rotational overload. If we load the limbs on the shorts with the wearable resistance, we produce an overload of the thigh musculature around the hip. If we overload the lower leg via the calf sleeves, we actually produce a rotational overload around the knee and the hip. So this is one of the unique things about wearable resistance. It actually provides a rotational overload, which is pretty cool because movement is the result of rotation at the hip and the shoulder joints and knee joints and ankle joints. Also, as soon as we load these athletes, not only is it an increase in vertical momentum, but there's an increase in horizontal momentum. Okay, so this is important when we start looking at this next slide. So let's have a look how wearable resistance can influence change of direction performance. One of the interesting papers that has just come out recently, well, it's not a paper actually, it came out in Simply Faster in a blog by this gentleman by the name of Pedro Alcaraz. He actually compared a training intervention where he compared vest loading with some electromechanical device. Apologies, it hasn't come out in a peer-reviewed publication, it was just on the blog's post. And so therefore there was absence of details there. But very interestingly, he found that the wearable resistance vest loaded condition was superior to the electromechanical device overload. He said that it actually increased the maximum sprint speed, but also reduced the change of direction deficit. That is the difference between the sprint times and the change in direction times. And he concluded that weighted vests must be considered a highly specific method for training the ability to change direction and agility. And it is a very specific training method. You just think about the limitations of some of the devices out there, whereas training with a wearable resistance, you can go anywhere at any velocity in any direction, whether it be vertical, horizontal, or lateral. So it is a great training device for change direction. I want to take you through this. This is let's just say this is a 505 test. We start here, we run 5 meters, we do a 180-degree turn and come back. Now this 505 can be divided up into different phases. Here's an initial acceleration phase. It's predominantly concentric propulsive in nature. Then we've got this deceleration phase, which is overloading the eccentric braking phase. Then we transfer, we've got all this horizontal momentum that we've got to decelerate, then recelerate. So this is more like a slow velocity, stretch, shortened cycle propulsion. Then we've got the final acceleration where we're actually moving the quickest in this 505. So it's like a high velocity, stretch, shortened cycle propulsive phase. So wearable resistance, if we were going to break up the change of direction into these phases and these different qualities, wearable resistance we can use in a number of ways, okay? Firstly, by putting the wearable resistance on, it's going to change the momentum. So it's going to be harder to get it going initially, but once we get it going, it's going to provide a additional momentum coming into the turn. So we're going to have to, it's going to overload the eccentric braking. Also, because we're trying to harness this horizontal momentum and transfer it in the other direction, we can actually think about it trying to transfer that energy from coming this way to that way. And then that when we get up into this phase here, we're actually starting to actually play around with this kinetic energy phase here, where we're starting to move quite quickly. Also, if we take the kinetic energy formula back into this initial acceleration phase, we see that we're not going to be moving very quickly here or here. So we can overload more so with the wearable resistance. Whereas in this phase here, if we were actually making this the training emphasis, we most probably would like to load a little bit less with the wearable resistance. But because velocity is slower here and here, we can think about overloading more so with the vest or the lower limb loading. So depending on phase, you can actually use wearable resistance loading in a very different manner to increase the momentum, or to actually overload the propulsive phases, or load lighter in acceleration phases. So where are we? Well, we understand the use of vest loading very well. However, we do not understand where we are in terms of change of direction with the limb loading. So there's a little bit of research to be done there. What about wearable resistance and jumping? Well, here's a jump signal. Here's the propulsive phase. These two flat line phases are on a force plate, and they show that we're in the air. And then these are the landing phases. As you can see, the landing forces are far greater than the propulsive forces. So one of the worries about using wearable resistance is that we're going to increase the landing forces. Let me assure you we don't. We've had a look at the literature, and loads up to 3 to 11.5% body mass do not change the ground reaction forces. And this is why. As you can see, a ground reaction force is made up of your mass times the acceleration that you put into the plate times the acceleration due to gravity. When you're unloaded, you jump higher. However, when you put wearable resistance on, you don't jump as high. And so therefore the influence of the acceleration due to gravity on your center of mass is less, okay? So the net ground reaction force when you're overloaded with wearable resistance is pretty much the same. So you don't have to worry about increasing the landing ground reaction forces. So you can see by the basketball player here that you can overload your movement specific drills very easily, and you're jumping. And so you're actually resistance training as part of what you do in basketball. So how can we use it in the propulsive phase? Well, we know we can use loads up to 3 to 6% body mass, and it reduces your power output. Of course it does. Even though there's an increase in mass and force, your velocity is reduced. So the idea of training is actually to return to your baseline measures of power output, then strip the wearable resistance off, and then you will be jumping. You'll have higher propulsive forces and greater jump height as a result. In terms of your landing phase, you don't have to worry about the landing forces getting any larger and causing injury. And the other interesting thing, if you actually want to improve your eccentric braking forces, then do drop jump training, because what you do with drop jump training is that you actually standardize the jump height. And so therefore it will not be affected as much as those other jumps, the counter movement jump, the vertical jump, and the pogo jump. What about wearable resistance and optimizing transference? Well, we all know that this type of training, traditional strength training, does not typically transfer that well to sport-specific motions such as basketball. So, and that's no wonder, because this is pretty much vertically oriented. This player here is, vertical and horizontal. This is bilateral propulsion. This is unilateral propulsion. This is acyclic. This is cyclic. This is more force dominant. This is more velocity dominant, and so on and so forth. The point being here is that wearable resistance is a great way of optimizing your strength gains to what you actually want the outcomes to be, because you're doing strength training as part of what you're doing. The other thing that I want to talk about here, because I know this is a problem with many basketball teams, is the effect of congested schedules. One of the things that we really want to do, we take any of these parameters on the left-hand side here, and we actually say in the off-season, we try and improve them, then we got to do something in season to maintain them, so on and so forth over the course of many years. In this model, your strength or your power improves. Invariably though, what happens is in the off-season you improve, and the in-season, because you become time poor and all the competing technical and tactical demands, the actual strength power drop off. And this happens over consecutive years, and basically what happens here is the athlete stays the same biological status. So what's the secret to actually retaining or maintaining your strength power? Well, it's actually to make it part of what you do. Okay, your strength, endurance, speed should be part of your specific basketball sessions. And as a result, we should be able to actually either maintain or improve over many years. So here's some research that shows you how we've used this to actually sort of support some of this ways of maintaining. This is a study out of just published in the European Journal of Sports Science. It is actually an unloaded group, the control group, and a loaded group training once per week. Now, as you can see here in the middle, there are significant differences with large effects between the groups. The first thing that I want you to have a look at is the maximum force and maximum power. Training once a week without wearable resistance, there were these reductions, whereas with the wearable group, there were very minor non-significant reductions. Have a look at the speeds. Again, training unloaded, their sprint times got 4.9 to 4.2% slower, whereas there was minimal difference here and they were non-significant. So training once a week with wearable resistance was great for these rugby athletes to maintain some of their force and speed qualities. Also, what we've found from a soccer study in Argentina is just using wearable resistance as part of your warm-up, as you see here. And down below, a little bit of a technical, tactical type of stuff here, part of their warm-up. These players, over the course of a season, increased their speed by using wearable resistance in their warm-up, increased their horizontal leg power, and increased the repeated speed ability. So we can see that using it as part of your warm-up or part of just one session a week, we can actually maintain or improve fitness qualities. So in summary, basketball specific strength and movement training, that's what wearable resistance provides. Here are some of the physics in and around wearable resistance that underlie why it works. It's a great form of multiplanar propulsive and eccentric braking overload, really great for basketball. It's great for overloading the jumping, as well as a smart training option for congested schedule. Here are some of the research we're doing around the world, guys. Seed number 10 and 20, South America, Argentina, and New Zealand is the only countries we're doing any change of direction research, and that's in tennis and netball. So there's a lot of opportunity to get some change of direction research going. And finally, this is some of the areas that we're really interested in terms of change of direction. We're looking at sport-specific change of direction applications. Basketball would be fantastic to get some research there. We're interested in aerial change of direction. Basketball and sports like netball, they've got to have a very good aerial change of direction ability. Then we've got a whole lot of ideas around how we can look at the vest versus the lower limb around the acceleration, decel, etc. Phases of change of direction movements. That's it. If you have any questions, my email address is there, and stay curious.
And welcome back, everybody. JC, as always, thank you for the excuse me, the insight into the science. And moving to a third part of our webinar series now, welcoming in Carl Bergstrom out there back in Canada. Carl, you're in Toronto right now?
I am, yes, sir.
Well, we're really excited to have you here. Thanks again for taking some time. Before we get started, why don't you take a moment to tell people a little bit about yourself, your journey into the NBA and your experience in sport and training?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm going into my third season with the Warriors here. Uh, Quite a long kind of transition. I went to University of British Columbia. I did my undergrad and my master's there. I started like most strength coaches in a private facility, kind of a smaller athlete development facility where I worked with all sorts of sports, mainly hockey, but hockey, basketball, rugby, soccer. I mean, you name it. And I've always been incredibly passionate with sports, and I had an opportunity about 9 or 10 years ago to have this junior sports science role with the Vancouver Whitecaps. And I got brought in by two great mentors, and I had a fantastic growth in my profession in over about 5 years. And within that period, I was with the Vancouver Whitecaps. I worked with the women's national team for soccer. I had a private athlete development program for summer for ice hockey. And I was kind of had my feet in multiple different environments, just wanting to contribute to the well-being and the development of elite sport. And in these experiences, I was lucky enough to meet a great mentor and friend in Dr. Celebrini, who was the director for the Whitecaps as well as the Vancouver Canucks. And an opportunity came up to join into basketball, and I was fortunate enough to come down with him, and that's kind of the story. So, it took a really long time to get rolling, and last 3 years I've been down in San Francisco, so it's been great.
And we were talking about this before. We talk about this. I think everybody talks about this stuff every conversation. How is it now? You're there in Toronto, getting some training time in, but you're normally based out of San Francisco with the team, and then the West Coast, Vancouver, as you mentioned. Just some of the challenge you're seeing with the league and the training of the athletes. Looking at the SOPs you guys have got in place with the Warriors, and just share what do NBA fans and basketball fans have to look forward to coming up.
Yeah, I mean, COVID's been once in a lifetime thus far, and
let's hope.
Let's hope so, exactly. And we have a good group, and a lot of the players, basketball's like most sports, but even more so unique that these athletes just like to play, and they're used to playing constantly. Honestly, most of these guys don't go more than a week without a ball in their hands. And so to be in a situation with COVID where, guys weren't playing, weren't scrimmaging, it was a novel experience. And we had to get creative, especially in San Francisco, a 700 square foot apartment's a good space unless you're living down south. So, there's different strategies, teams where, they're sending out equipment. Definitely, I don't have stock in LILA or anything like that, but having a unit like this where we could have, done some box work or some closed space drills would have been fantastic. And, honestly, the biggest thing that we had to do is get on Zoom calls and get on the phone and encourage guys to stay active and stay motivated and just be prepared, because I mean, the world is filled with amazing sports, but I really do believe the NBA, I mean, from a physical perspective, is just so demanding, and you have to be prepared. You don't have, 2 to 3 months to decondition yourself. It's not made for that. So it was really, a battle, but we got creative in different ways to make sure guys, stayed in line, and whenever the season does come back, we'll be excited to show what we can do.
Yeah. Now you mentioned something there. It wasn't one of the question points we talked about earlier, but I wanted to ask about it because we were, you and Don and I were talking before, and with our work with some of the other pro sports that have just tremendously demanding schedules. Give people an idea. Explain throw those numbers out again. Number of games, flight times, etc. Because I think before, just so people understand, not a lot of people know what an elite or a pro athlete faces. Like you said, it's not the amateur guy who's got all summer long to work on his weaknesses.
No, that's a really good point. So I mean, our club's unique in that we've been in the finals 5 years in a row, pardon me. So we, our camp starts late September, and we ran all the way through till June, mid-June. But let's all that aside, from the first game of the season, which is, mid to late October, to the last game of the season, so not including preseason, not including playoffs, you have 82 games over 181 days. So that's a game every 2.2 days. Our club had, I think it was 56 flights over that period. So 56 flights in 181 days. A lot of East Coast travel. So we play every single East Coast team home and away. So that's one game. And, that's 3, 4, 5, 6 plus hour flights. So it's very, very demanding. And depending on how much you play, players, the physical and the mental demand and the demand outside of the sport is substantial. So, when you're in season, you do your absolute best to make sure you check off all the boxes and load appropriately. But you have to really triage and be very, very, very specific in and targeted with what you're trying to achieve when you work with an athlete outside of in games because of the demands of the schedule.
Yeah, and I remember when I was with the Grizzlies too, we were lucky. We really had one dedicated training session a week, and it was Saturday morning. And it was actually, back then, it was voluntary. A couple of younger guys, it was mandatory, but some of the senior guys did it because they wanted. But we weren't in the gym 3-4 times a week. We'd get anything we wanted and had time to do. It kind of had to happen in a warm-up or in these mini sessions.
Well, I will say, we have two completely different groups, but in both years, tremendous dedicated athletes. And, the strategy of little bits often is probably the best way to have success in modern day sport. And that's the way we approach it, whether it's before practice, after practice, pre-game, post-game, we got creative, but little bits often was the way to kind of skin the cat slowly.
Yeah. So now going into a little bit about our topic today, wearable resistance. You first connected with us, oh gosh, it's been a little while now, six months ago, I think, maybe a little longer even.
Yeah.
And you reached out and we started talking about what EXOGEN had to offer, and you've had some, what did you think when you first saw it? When you first looked at wearable resistance, what were the areas you were thinking that it seemed to have value? What kind of tweaked your interest? As you know, top programs and top people like yourself are always looking for ways to improve. What was those first impressions before you'd even started having a play with the kit?
Before, I was really intrigued in, I have a like most strength coaches, most performance coaches, we have a keen interest in training for appropriate transfer and having the mind-body connection to maximize that transfer. And, a big part of some of the literature shows that, athlete engagement and, the appropriate ecological environment is absolutely key for that transfer. And so, sometimes, I'd get creative and we might load and then go do something on court and then load and go do something on court. But the idea of having, a system or a unit similar to EXOGEN where we could load in their environments and have the athlete engage with what they're doing and focused and, going through their physical patterns, but as well as their sport specific patterns, like you mentioned, that's just a win-win. And that also ties back to having limited time based off of the schedule and the demands and trying to get the best bang for buck, if you want to say. Other than that, I had, Mark Ueyama, who told me about some of his utilizations that were fantastic. And Martin Bouchait had kind of mentioned it when we had a conversation around PSG. So, it came with a good reputation and I was very, very curious. So that's kind of where it led from.
That was all JC's reputation.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
No, yeah, well, yeah, and that's right, because our discussions started there with Mark out there with the Vikings, and I remember you mentioned about Martin up with PSG as well. So now we've talked a little bit through wearable for the last while. You've had some kit to start having a play with. Maybe share a little bit about what you're finding, some of the areas. Were you telling us about the 10K run the other day? but just some of the things you've been having a little play and exploring and feeling and finding. Now giving it a go.
Yeah, and coming back to your last question, other than the transfer, anytime we do loading, I think performance and I think injury prevention, or performance and building on longevity. So RTP, like return to play programming, and trying to get them on court and still get the appropriate loading for muscle or tendon, whatever you need to do. Like that was a big point of interest as well.
That's where Brianna started with the Vikings, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. They're doing some amazing things. But yeah, I mean, back to your point about more general kind of physical actions versus sport actions. As simple as having the calf sleeves on and doing a rudimentary series, which is Altus, Dan Pfaff, Jerry Ramagita, who's with us, he showed us doing a rudimentary hop series, or doing a dynamic warm-up, maybe 2 or 3 minute segments, and then change the orientation and then do it again, and do that 4 or 5 different times. And it's a bit redundant, but just that minimal change in the orientation of the weight, it has an effect. And the first time I did that, not a word of a lie, I felt like my whole foot, ankle, calf complex was just completely activated, because it was a subtle load, but the change of the load, that subtle movement variation just had an effect for me. And in basketball, the foot, ankle, knee complex is so key. If you look at pretty much every college player in the United States has their ankles taped, from 16 up. And so, if you want to talk about restriction and dorsiflexion or what that effect could be, we don't need to get into that. But, knees and ankles and Achilles, and those are things that you always have to be concerned with. So I like to target some loading where we can kind of challenge that in a safe way. So you have rudimentary series, dynamic warm-ups, and even if you're comfortable, even having them doing dribbling patterns where it's linear, lateral, multi-directional, and then you give them, an open space and take 30 seconds. I want you to be creative and just dribble. And then you do the calf sleeves, and then you might do the forearm sleeves where you can challenge the upper body as well as the lower body. You just get creative. From a prescriptive perspective, I've played around a little bit with, one is, having themes. So, doing a single leg and rotational theme versus, maybe a bilateral and lateral theme. Right. And what I tend to like to do is, my mentor always had this concept of catch and release, and I apply it more to a performance point where I use a unit and then I take it off and then I release them and I have them do the action again. So we might do, a single leg position where they're just working on holding that balance and going into a propulsive phase, into a shot or to a cut or to some action that's specific to their game. We might do a very similar thing, but instead of working on the propulsive phase, we might have, the athlete or even myself or however we're going through it, drive into it and absorb that force, working that eccentric braking capacity and drive out of it to a different basketball action. So again, we're kind of merging that physical with the basketball action. And a lot of times I'll let them kind of dictate that themselves. And that's not, these are just different ideas. The sky is the limit, because often when you get into that environment, the athlete can be creative, or you can have a conversation as to how, they're best going to utilize it.
It's probably, and I think when I first started creating it, 2003, I've talked about that. I was trying to just add weight to specific, as I talked about in the intro, I was trying to get loading into athletic movements, jumps and plyometrics and drills like that we were throwing sleds into, or cones or heavy weighted vests. But the thing without a doubt that you mentioned on and touched on, and I'm going to ask JC, we talk about it a lot, is that ability to really just, the user defines the motion. So that means any motion can be loaded. And some of them are very specific to a weakness they might be working on that their opponents know in a very high level sport, like a like you said, like you get two guards that meet each time a lot in the season, and they're two teams that know they're going to meet in the playoffs. Those two guys know each other's tendencies, and they're thinking and preparing for that. And being able to work on those is critical. And that's all that ability to really add load into the body, like you said, where the player's guiding it, not just the S&C putting load on you, telling you what to do. That's all around that term that we use, movement variability. One for the injury rehab side, but JC, we talk about that a lot. That need to have movement variability, both as a protective mechanism, but also because the real game demands it. You never know what the athlete's going to be under, and trying to recreate that in training is difficult. And we've seen this across sport. JC, do you want to comment on that from the research side, even what we need to look at and we want to look at?
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of the cornerstone benefits of the wearable resistance, I believe, and it was great to hear you, Carl, just talk about all that variability in your program, from single, rotational type movements to bilateral, and changing the orientations. That athlete is just getting a very rich context of subtle changes and variations in movement, which the body has to react to. And so all those muscles that have been lazy over time, we started to tuck into synergistics, that muscles that haven't possibly been used. And as a result, that variability, I believe, and I think we all believe, most probably prepares them better for some of those forces or some of those movement patterns that occur during a game or during a training that they're not quite prepared for. So they're a little bit more, and Joe coined the term injury resistance. So I think it's one of its great benefits for sure, is the way you can actually just change that orientation, change that placement from those, lateral, medial, anterior, posterior, proximal, distal, to get such movement variability in your program. So it was good to hear. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. And for all the young strength coaches, and one of the things, regardless of the sport, is some cultures, perhaps rugby, football, like even hockey. I mean, all sorts of them. Like, you lift weights because you need to stay strong. You need to have injury resistance, as Joe says, and people are completely connected to it. In other sports, there might be a bit more resistance, like in soccer/football. There might be some resistance, although there's a trend going in a different direction. But when you can connect, without making inferences, but when you can connect with those athletes so that they understand what they're doing in the weight room is meant to help them on the court, or in their sport, that's when you get that athlete buy-in. So, certain strategies, even doing like a potentiation or a French contrast with an athlete, which is really kind of vertical, or bilateral in emphasis, right prior to going on court with an EXOGEN suit, where you might work on a 2-foot jump, so like a maximal effort jump shot, or something that's more vertical or bilateral in essence. And then you take off the unit, and then you let them kind of be free and go back into their training environment. There's a nice continuum of them understanding that everything that they're doing is connecting with their sport, but also understanding that you're hitting the physical, and you're leading more to a sport specific environment, and they tend to connect well with that and respond well to that.
You mentioned, and for basketball, again, having worked with elite and NBA level basketball and pro football, they're different beasts too. They're not rugby players and gridiron players who kind of like the beat up of the gym, and they didn't grow up in that environment. They like playing their sport and not much else, and they're highly sensitive, and being able to put resistance into not just that environment and that physicality, but that mindset. And you mentioned that earlier. And this is something we talked about a lot with Martin. Basketball's like soccer, football, is these guys are really sensitive. The flow in that movement is continuous. It's not stop and start. Like Martin said, he said, Joe, you can take a rugby player into the gym, and right after he finishes banging out squats, you can take him on the field, and he doesn't care how much it hurts. He just wants to hit something. But you take a footballer into the gym and he does a set of squats, he wants 3 days to recover. Because he doesn't want that movement flow changed.
Yeah, Absolutely. And yeah, and that's, John and I had a conversation last week about, getting the appropriate load to affect change. We're talking about first step, and it's a balance between, following the physics and getting enough stimulus, and also not, getting into their environment, their sport environment, their world, and changing their biomechanics, or trying to do too much too quick, where they feel like you're kind of overstepping your boundaries. So on one point, you want to make sure you load enough so you can have performance gains. On the other, you have to be very strategic in how progressively you load them, so that they're comfortable with it, and they don't feel like they're getting worse, or they're not jumping as high, or things like that.
Yeah. Now here's a thought, or just going back to this whole thing about the athletic action, a basketball action, and an NBA action. Can you comment a little bit on how you think, and just, value? We get asked a lot about things like, well, where does your traditional resistance still fit in, and how do you manage it? EXOGEN, like anything else, is a tool. It doesn't apply across the board. It has versatility, but it really is about knowing your weakness, right? And just comment a little bit on your thoughts on sort of athletic actions, and when you think at the NBA level, you might put it in at certain times of the season or in season. And we'll leave the return to play. I think we'll have a little chat about that as a completely separate area. But and then even working very player specific, some ideas you have just on NBA actions and the reality behind the timing you have for that. Just a general comment on that process.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Multiple questions.
Yeah, that's like a 2-hour topic.
Yeah, trying to think where to start. I mean, every single player in the league should be loading, 2 to 3 days a week, or, depending on the schedule. If you have 4 games in a week, you might cut that down to 1. If you have 3 games in a week, 2 to 3, depending on your minutes. If you have a shorter week, you should be able to get 3 plus loading sessions. But you have to be strategic. And again, I live by the little bits often, and keep the loads high, keep the volume low. Again, the knee dominant demand on the sport is so high. So if you're going to load a guy, do you want to back squat him ass to grass, or do you want to, maybe hit some posterior chain, or hit something that might be preventative in nature, maintain some of their strength qualities, but not add load to something that, requires recovery, which is, the knees and things like that. You can be strategic, around, different tendon loading and things like that, or you look at the schedule, and anytime you have the rarities that you have more than 2 days in between games, you can get after it. So you're making sure that you're still getting those strength stimulus. And that's where, depending on the schedule, if you want to work on performance variables outside of games, you might get the EXOGEN suit on and go out and spend 15 minutes with an athlete, working on their propulsive phase, or their first step, as we say, prior to practice. Take the unit off, let them go. Pretty much every player in the NBA can, hit their head through a roof. I mean, you have the odd guy who has a 28-inch vertical, but they can all jump through the roof. So that's a physical quality, and there is, there's the question, how high is high enough, and most of them kind of already check that box off. But you look at other physical qualities like second jump. Joe, you had that test that you talked about with the Grizzlies, whatever it was, 30 years ago, maybe 20. Yeah. I mean, those are qualities that are just as important or more important. Again, it's funny, when I first started this job, I was looking at different evaluation techniques, and I wanted to do a 30-meter sprint, and it's what I was comfortable with. It's what, we had used in soccer. But then one of the guys who'd been there for a long time, he said, well, why are you doing a 30-meter sprint? The court's only 28.7 meters long.
Is he going straight up to the dressing room after that?
Exactly. And he said that, I'm like, man, you're so right. And so if you look at the dimensions of a court, it's, it's 28.7 by 15.2 meters. For my American friends, it's 94 feet by 50 feet. I mean, there's not that much real estate out there. There's 10 people on the court. If you look at pace or possession rates, the average team, might get on a slow day, they might get 95 to 100 possessions in a game. That's over 48 minutes. On a fast game, 110, 115. So with a 24-second shot clock in this tight space, your possession time can go anywhere between 8 and 13 seconds on average per game. So that's pretty quick. And the only reason I'm saying that is, as you work back from the sport, and you can look at it as, sport actions, or you can look at it from physical actions, but the pace is fast, the transitions are fast, there's not a lot of space, so you have to be able to drive into it, you have to be able to break frequently, you have to be able to cut out of that, and you have to have the whole, perception, technical skills to support, or you have to have the physical qualities to support the technical and tactical and decision-making skills that are required to succeed,
And and it's funny you mentioned that, like taking a look at whether it's an NBA action or an NBA demand. What are you seeing when you see these new players coming in from college and they're trying to prepare themselves for the pro game? Aside from obviously the incredible demand of a season, whether you go to the playoffs or not, the travel, the schedule, the being away from home, the psychology, the pressure from outside in the press. But now looking at the physical demand, what are the things you're trying to get them upskilled and up to speed on as quick as possible coming into the pro program? What do those first challenges look like?
Oh, it's a great question. Again, it depends on the position. If they're, 1 year out of college or 4 years out of college. 4 years out of college, you have a lot of benefits. They're just older. They're
like an example, though, I was going to say, sorry, I forgot what that point. It was going off your point talking about all these guys can jump. And mostly, as you know, at the high school and college level, everybody's working on vertical jumping, right? That's kind of one of the core tools, plyometrics, vertical jumps. Every S&C coach in high school and college is jumping these kids to the max. If they haven't got it by the time they get the pros, it's not going to show up.
Yeah, and they're here for a reason. Yeah.
So you're not trying to bring his vertical jump up. That's your college kid from high school, or your high school kid from junior high. So but what are those? And speed is there. Now that movement quality gets really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the movement quality is everything. It's the game is so much faster, and so them adjusting to that in their own way is absolutely pivotal. Honestly, the biggest thing that you're trying to teach is, you can explain about how challenging the schedule and how demanding the schedule is, but until you go through that, you can't really understand it. So as they come in, you want to get them as robust as possible. Put them in a position where they can maintain their true, or their more pure strength work. Put them in positions that they can tolerate a lot of load. So if you want to do additional work because they're not getting a lot of playing time, you can go out and do extra work after games. Body composition and nutrition is absolutely pivotal. It's something that young athletes typically don't understand because they still have a six-pack, because they haven't really caught up to that.
You can not drink all week and they'll still have that six-pack.
Yeah, exactly. And 6 months into the grind, you start seeing some of those compositions go up and muscle mass go down. So long story short, is just trying to teach them how to be a good professional and how to never not get too high, not get too low, but be even keel, and then make sure they can tolerate the loads throughout.
Well, it's funny. The word that always comes up, and this is something, John knows from my personal growth and interest in the field, is really around this word flow. And having, and one thing, I've taken a lot of athletes from that college to that pro level. And I've had guys come back from the combine and from NBA camps and tryouts, and they always use that word. They're like, said, and we test them on the 40. These guys are through the roof. They can beat anybody in the NFL at a 40 coming out of college. But they just come back, and once they get onto those one-on-ones or on court, they just say, you know what? I don't have to do any more of those plyos. I don't have to do any more of those sprints. That's not helping me anymore. He said, these guys just move different. And the word they start using, these guys just have flow. And flow is that response to variability in traffic, in real game, with focus. And this is something I think that I'm most excited about, where something like EXOGEN gives us an ability to really stress a person while they're trying to concentrate on flow. And flow is multifactorial, right? It's the moment everything comes together. the concentration on the basket, the proprioceptive awareness of the traffic therein, the movement they're trying to do, and the perfect timing of it all. You know, we haven't looked at this yet from the research, but I thought maybe just you might have some comments, because the better you can adjust the flow, I think the better you adjust to whatever the next level of your competition is. And I think wearable resistance has an incredible value for that, because the base foundation's been built.
No, I love that point, and I can tell you this, and you'll all agree with me, but the best athletes in every environment I've ever been in, their intention, their focus, or if you want to call it flow during practice, is as close to, you know, a game as possible. And that shows at every single level. When they're practicing, all they're thinking about is what they're doing, how they're doing it at a maximal intensity. And that intensity doesn't have to be, you know, 45 minutes, but because they don't have the time for that. But even if it's a 12-minute kind of stimulus where they're just focusing on what they need to focus on, they are so engaged, and there's nothing that's breaking that engagement and that intensity. So coming back, you know, if you have something that isn't going to take away from that purpose, that focus, but can also build on physical qualities within their environment, I mean, as long as it's safe and you're not adding load, you know, before a back-to-back, I can't see how it, you know, you can ask for more.
It's 100%. And this is why one, you know, sort of rule number one with wearable resistance is the person should be challenged but not compromised. And they love it. The best guys, the guys that are great movers, the hustlers, the people that rely on that speed and the quickness and the vertical jump, they love the intensity of it. But the great movers and the flow athletes say, I love that when I'm wearing EXOGEN, it's forcing me to concentrate even more. I have to be even a little bit more focused than I would normally be. And you see how they like when the window goes to this, because a high intensity game is in that little channel. And it's always been a fascinating comment I get on, they don't say things like, oh, I like the speed, I like the power. No, they say, I love the challenge of the extra focus I need with that load in that position to really be perfect.
That's spot on. And I said it earlier, but even a dynamic warm-up where you're changing all the patterns, it makes you focus. It makes you a little bit more aware, because it just feels a little bit different. You're not kind of just walking through it.
Yeah,
you know,
you can get robotic in training, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it comes back, I've mentioned the rudimentary series, but Jerry Ramajita, who's with us here, he always talks about how valuable a warm-up can be if the intent is there and the focus is there. And so again, it's like if you have something that can, one, load them, but also increase their intent or their emphasis or their focus, you know, it's a win-win.
Yeah. Just because of time, a quick thought from the both of you. Return to play. We both know this is a massive area. And JC, you know, I don't know how many teams we're working with now across the world in pro sport, but it's a lot. And I'd say 30 to 50% of them come to us at some point because of injury issue. And you know, that's issue number one. Just maybe touch on what you think in that return to play space. Just so you know, we've had this question. People were asking about RTP protocols. When do you use wearable? Well, I think people might not fully understand what return to play is, where it fits in. And just to clarify that from my perspective, please add, when the injury's healed and the person's returning, so it's sort of stage 2, stage 3, they've been released from the injury. They're no longer rehabilitating the injury. So if you're looking at an ACL, you're past X amount of months and the graft is sealed. If it's a bone, you're past your 6 weeks. And so now the body's rebuilding itself and you're working on return to play, not remodeling and repairing soft tissue. And so people, you know, just some thoughts on where wearable resistance fits in. Again, movement variability in this recovery stage and injuries and return to play. I'll leave it to you guys to add some thought on that. Carl, maybe you want to start on your thoughts?
I can start. So, I mean, when we think of return to play, you can think of return to performance, and they're not always the same. So when you have an injury, depending on what it is, you have that acute phase where you're really just trying to get the athlete to a point where they can function even at a lower capacity, you know, bike, swim, whatever it is. So there's that acute phase where the performance is not really in mind. It's more settling down the injury and getting them to a point where they can exercise, even work around the injury. Then you have, you know, they slowly clear out of that, and your goal is return to play, but return to play often comes before return to performance. So somebody might come off, you know, a 9-month injury, and they might be cleared to play. They might pass all the tests, but they're not at their performance levels, their previous performance levels or their capacity levels. And there is that little gap where you have to continue to push that athlete and work on a performance model safely that's going to get them back to the level that they were or higher. That's kind of the goal. But often they're interchangeable. You know, in almost every sporting environment, the goal after an injury is to get that athlete back into their environment safely and as fast as possible. You know, so if you're in soccer, I mean, even if you're getting out there doing a 1-touch, 2-touch, or getting on a court and doing stationary drills where they're just doing jump shots, even if they can't jump, just getting into their form shots. Or, you know, who knows if it's a groin issue or a lumbopelvic hip issue, who knows, you know, perhaps you can use an EXOGEN suit and create movement variability, or even create a bias for a different movement strategy, just so, you know, if a guy, you know, if an athlete, you know, he or she is having issues kind of getting onto an injured leg, you might, you know, change the load to force them to get onto that leg, get them comfortable on that leg, do more athletic patterns that are linear, lateral, multi-directional. And then, you know, I'm kind of ranting here, but it's kind of endless. You know, you can use it in any facet as long as you're not going to make the injury worse. And so if you can load them in that environment, get them there quicker, then it's very beneficial.
And it comes back to that word, you know, that return to play stage is they've been away from the specificity and the demand of not just the game, but the environment, the court. Like you said, they might have spent the last X amount of time at the physio clinic. And if they're on an IR list, you know, maybe they're not even allowed to be on court. There's a lot of regulations around certain things, but getting them to, and that means they haven't experienced the intensity. They haven't experienced the variability. And John, you know, we've talked a little bit about this, the movement variability area in return to play, and where you think this is going to be a really critical step for things like wearable resistance as a tool moving forward. Some of the engagements you've had with teams and programs.
Yeah, I like that division in that return to performance and return to play, Carl. I see that return to performance is fairly non-specific, you know, getting people to just to run, you know, cut direction, you know, change directions, cut, etc. Could be unrelated to the sport, but we're actually getting them into those movement patterns that are non-specific to the sport. So just getting them ready to go into that return to play mode. And you know, obviously wearable resistance has a real place for that return to performance, as to with the return to play, when all those sort of movements, running, jumping, you know, hopping, cutting, become very movement specific. And so the wearable resistance has got a place there, especially if we want to actually, you know, time poor, want to inject a lot more mechanical overload into the system, or a lot more metabolic overload. We certainly can do that with the wearable resistance. And then we just got to, you know, as you say, the scope to address the nuances of those injuries, or the nuances of the movement patterns is huge. You know, we know that we can use it as a coaching corrective tool. A lot of people are using it as a corrective tool. If we see we are seeing something continuing to be a little bit lazy because of that injury, we can actually load to exaggerate it, or we could load to correct it. So, you know, yeah, it's an exciting piece of technology for that area as well. It's got so many applications everywhere. It's mind-boggling, really.
Well, and we're gonna have a webinar soon. I'm actually just putting the finishing touch on this other webinar, which I've got to record after this for Argentina, as you know, with the guys at Ergo Lab in Cordoba. They're doing this weekend, and this is specifically on wearable resistance for assistive loading versus resistive loading. And Carl, even at the NBA level, I think people often forget they're still human. They're not perfect at everything, and when a person's injured, a big area they're not able to even understand is reconnecting what is the right movement. And we can put a load on a body to accentuate the correct movement and to help just awareness and proprioception that just gets them back into the right pattern. You know, they haven't used their lower back, they've had a low back strain. We can put the bit of loading and a very light loading directly over the area that was hurt because they haven't felt it for a while. And it allows them to focus and concentrate on that area during a drill. And at the end of the drill, like, yeah, that area is tired. I was able to work it. If the load isn't there, I'm just not aware of it. And it's literally that intrinsic cue, like the coaching hand that's on the body or the physio's hands. And then once we see that awareness improve and they're feeling connected to that injured area, then we go and switch the load to the other side. And now we resistive load that. And that's where that muscle on this side is now working to rotate the other side of the body. And I think that assistive, John, like you said, that assistive resistive contrasting is just a phenomenal area because injuries are two-part. And one of the biggest things coming back I've always seen in that return to play is they're ready to go, but they just haven't connected to that injured area for a long time. And it shows up in the movement. And sometimes it becomes chronic.
I mean, you're spot on, and I mean, you're both spot on. The one thing on top of, you know, we're talking a lot about movement transfer and physical qualities in the return to play, but you know, being in this environment, there's two parts that we always have to remember is, you know, after any type of injury, there's a psychological component, and returning to a high performance environment, you know, it requires a certain amount of psychological readiness, and that's something that we have to be aware of. A guy can, you know, he can run his, you know, his 4.5 minute mile. I mean, that's pretty generous, but he can check off all the physical boxes. But if they haven't, you know, had the exposure in their environment, their sport, the less exposure they've had in that sport, the less likely they're going to feel psychologically ready. That's my opinion. And that's one. The second one is, you know, literature shows over and over, as soon as you have a cognitive component to a drill, you know, the demand on that athlete is significantly higher. So when we're thinking, okay, you know, this athlete can check off all the physical boxes, but they haven't, you know, been in their environment long enough where cognitive components being addressed. And then, you know, you try to bottleneck, okay, now he's ready for court or she's ready for court, but they haven't had that exposure. And then you give them like 7 to 10 days to get that, you know, that might not be enough of the mental engagement into their environment to prepare them for performance. So if you have a tool that can load as well as touch on, you know, the cognitive component in their environment, as well as, you know, build up their psychological readiness profile for that return, you're kind of checking off a lot of boxes.
Yeah.
You know, great tool to add to that.
100%. And this is what we're trying to do now. You know, it's not just about having a vertical jump. We're just getting so much more organic, more smart, more integrated in solutions that we're putting in. And we're understanding things like individualization and specificity and overload on a whole different level than I think, and a very personal level. Like there's not a one-stop solution. And that's why I think wearable resistance is such a complement to the toolbox in taking that. And the key word we all touched on was transference. You know, you can do a lot here in the training center with the young athlete that will transfer to them as a young athlete, but doesn't transfer as they continue down the chain. And so guys, we've got a bunch of questions. I'm just going to go through them fairly quick. This one's from Kyle Upmore. Kyle's a great guy. He's up in China, high performance coach with China Olympic Council. And just Kyle, if I screwed that up. And his question here is for you, Carl. I know.
So Joe, you cut out.
We're not hearing you, Joe. Uh-oh. You there, Carl?
I'm there. Yeah. Joe's. Uh-oh.
Hopefully he bounces back in. Or it might be a good time to say.
He's gonna pop back in.
Yeah, sorry guys, we jumped off there for a sec. But anyway, the question about front and back loading and what single step, first step for Kyle.
Oh, is there a question or just a curiosity?
Curiosity, yeah, oh, sorry, the question was there a difference for first step explosiveness between the front of the thigh and the back of the thigh? Now, JC, you and I know it really stimulates different muscle groups, anterior chain versus posterior chain, but the specific question was for you, Carl. Have you had to think about that? Just anterior versus posterior loading for first step explosiveness.
Yeah, I mean that you kind of just answered the question from a biomechanical or from a muscle loading perspective. To be honest, the way I've utilized it, I've always kind of used all different variations for most of the drills. So I've rarely, to this point, in a return, or there are specific situations where I would, front load the quad to really challenge that eccentric braking capacity if there's a cut, or if there's a deficit from his anterior to posterior chain. But honestly, I think bang for buck, if you try different orientations and you allow the athlete to focus and work through that different movement strategy, you're going to get a lot out of it. So I wouldn't, there are different purposes, but that's the way I've utilized it so far.
100%. And I think, and that's one of the things, all our guidelines are there. We've got the 6 loading profiles and it's pretty straightforward. One thing I know from sprinters, and we worked with literally the best sprinters in the world, from a speed perspective in that first acceleration out of the block or from a single start, that front loading is what most athletes prefer. It gets them moving quickly, and a lot of that activation comes from the anterior chain. As people move into a sort of a top speed or a more upright position, posterior chain, like a footballer running down the field, they all love that anterior loading. But sometimes, like you said, it's so easy to switch. You don't have to stick to one. If the athlete's telling you, I actually feel it more in the back, listen to them. You might not really understand why, it might not make sense, but his body understands something. And I think, like you said, you've got to explore and experiment a little bit, but definitely as a general rule, if you're starting from a first step or an early acceleration, I know we've seen the anterior loading profile being sort of selectively chosen by speed athletes as a starting point. Thanks, Kyle. Kyle, you can email me, or we can get a chat and talk a little bit offline about that too. And I can connect you guys together later on when you've got some time there and with China Olympic Council. Another question that came up, just in general, for an amateur athlete, where would you suggest a starting amateur athlete would use something like wearable resistance? We've talked a lot about the elite and the NBA, and everybody gets that. But one of the questions was, I don't understand a lot of what you guys talked about in the science, but I see it has value. I'm an amateur basketball player. Yeah. How would I use it? And I think it's a really good question. First, I'll tell you, we've got a lot of guidelines for our base guidelines for training for people. So do check out online, because we got a lot of amateurs using it very directly. But Carl, in basketball, what would you suggest?
Honestly, this is maybe not the answer you're looking for, but I'm not sure it would be any different. I think so. a lot of what this is in the value, you can't get tied down into the science, and that's clearly not what this person, I didn't get their name, is not trying to do. But if you go out, and I'm barely an amateur athlete, okay? So I used this unit for like 2 months, and I did everything. I did karaoke's, dynamic warm-ups, rudimentary series. I did zigzag patterns like I was in 8th grade, literally with the ball. Get to the side cut, get to the side cut. I did, lateral, we call it blood alley, like elbow to elbow, lateral shuffles. I did absolutely everything that I did in high school. And I worked through it. I had days where I went out and did 100 shots, and I did 10 different orientations on my quads. And then the next time I did it on my calf. And I just, if you're passionate with basketball and you get out there, you're gonna kind of find what you're looking for. Now, if you're looking for a specific physical outcome or basketball outcome, then following the protocols that Joseph's talking about, or the theory behind this system, that'll help you a little bit more.
Yeah, and one of the things I'll suggest, and I don't have the gentleman's name who asked that question, but one thing we say is, you get a pair of calf sleeves, put it on. Say you're going to play basketball. Maybe for a lot of people in sport, they just play their sport. They don't train a lot for it, but they'll play 2-3 times a week, and they want to do a little bit to improve. The nice thing about it is, as you said, JC, everybody's time poor, so we don't recommend you go out and do another EXOGEN session. Just wear it for the first 20-30 minutes of your game on court in your warm-up. Strip it off and continue your session. Do that for 6 weeks. What do you think is going to happen? You're just going to notice movement quality, speed. And JC, this is just maybe do a quick explanation on the Argentina warm-up study for football, soccer, which was exactly what we saw. And I think we can maybe talk about just using it in your already existing warm-up protocol.
Well, if you think, we've always sort of maintained, or we thought that if you have got a good, well-structured warm-up, you'll be able to touch base with strength, power, speed, stamina, change of direction ability. All those things, all those sort of things happen within a warm-up. Then we actually thought to ourselves, well, why don't we just overload that? Why don't we just overload a warm-up and see what happens? And that's what we did with this Argentina study. They just used it. They did just a general ramp protocol for the first 8 or so minutes. Then they went into a sort of like a technical kicking type of the drills that you saw on the slides for about 10. Then they spent 8 minutes just doing these sprints, these backward, forward sprints, etc., like that. And blow me down, after 6 to 8 weeks of that, 3 times a week, they've got significantly, the loaded group was significantly faster compared to the unloaded. They were jumping further. They had better repeated sprint ability. And so it's just confirmed a thought, a warm-up can be more than a warm-up. It can actually, act as something else to actually retain, maintain, or actually train these qualities. And everybody warms up. So why not use it as part of it,
And it sort of goes back to, Carl, what was I love that quote you were using. I love it so much that I forgot it, but it was on do more with less. It was the mini, basically, be frequent.
Little bits often.
Little bits often.
Yeah.
And that's what your warm-up is, So you gotta, if you're an amateur player and you just want to, you're competitive, you want to be better, get it on. And those sessions there, Carl, we've talked about, having it on with a player for 10, 20 minutes and bringing everything up. And Coach Dwayne Miller, who's out here, who is coach with USA Track and Field, now out here in Malaysia, he said the same thing. He uses it for glute activation in the warm-up, and his sprinters are pop, 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 pop. And you see that over time. And I think it's just a great and simple way to be time efficient. And the product was designed to be that way. Get it on, load, take the product off or leave it on, and go into your game. And just like we say, don't change what you're doing, just change what you wear. And I think anybody who's listening right now, you don't have to make it too complex. One thing we've seen also is when you train with it, and Carl, you experienced this. The first thought is, okay, where do I load? What do I do? Well, guess what? Go for a run, put it on the front, put it on the back, a kilometer later, move it around. By the end of a few sessions, you have such an awareness of how your body responds and what moving the weight does. The bells just start going off, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I just did 6 minutes on, 1 minute off for 10K, and I changed the orientation every 6 minutes. And now I get it. I know which orientations are going to help me, which ones are going to hinder me. Even little things that I didn't think of. 300 grams on my forearms, and my arm swings better, so I'm more engaged and I'm generating power from my upper body. These are things
cool.
I never even would have thought of. And I was telling Joe earlier, I had my best 10K time with the unit on 2 days ago, and I think that's partially there, or maybe I was just having a good day. But as I work through the unit, you understand it very quickly, and you internalize a lot of what's happening, and it's almost like a learning a new behavior. Your focus, your intent is there for patterns that you've kind of just walked through, whether it's running or playing sports or even lifting weights. Like you can mix it up pretty good.
Yeah, and I think what we'll do is we're going to stop on that. There's one more question, because such an interesting question, and I want to ask this one from Conrad. Conrad is he's a referee. And he just said, I'm a basketball referee. As the game of basketball becomes more and more demanding, it also affects how referees need to adapt to the game. And man, you see this because there are viral videos out there of referees running as fast as LeBron James or running as fast as Cristiano Ronaldo in sport. And I just keep thinking, man, these guys, well, they're paid well, but it's a demanding game. His question, have you considered to use it in wearable resistance in basketball refereeing physical training? What do you think? Do you think it'd be useful? Carl, I'll leave that nice question to you.
Absolutely would be useful. I mean, I know I don't know what the protocol is in the NBA. I know the MLS has a referee training program where they use a
high level one.
Yeah, they use GPS, you know, the whole 9 yards. Referees have one of the hardest jobs, and I think finally leagues realize that, so they're taking care of them. So 100%. I mean, you know what? You're probably using 94 feet of that court a lot more than most guys. So absolutely, you know, and get the arm swing in there, get the forearm sleeve, and work through so you can get the whistle up quickly.
I was going to say, and guess what? You don't get a sub.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you what, I love that question. And our gentleman's name again, Conrad. Conrad, you, as I said earlier on the website or on the Facebook, that we're going to be offering a free pair of calf sleeves to somebody today. And that question just won you a free pair of calf sleeves, Conrad. So we'll connect with you. Grace is going to connect with you offline, and we'll get your feedback on getting calf sleeves into your footwork and your refereeing. So thanks so much for that question. Lastly, I'll just answer a question that we often get. So people often say, you talked about suits, where would I start in basketball? Our recommendation for most sports is you don't have to buy a full suit. There's one or two pieces that give you that first bang for buck. Our suggestion is for basketball, it's calf sleeves and forearm sleeves. Carl, would you say those are a fair place to start for people? You know, arm movement, calf, leg movement, cost effective.
Yeah, I would say
easy way to start.
I would say for sure, but then also after talking to John, if you want to work on your first step specifically, so you know, a jab step or driving off one leg forward, I would look at the quad sleeves as well, or the hip sleeve. The shorts. Yeah. Just because in tighter spaces you can get a little bit more bang for buck, but if you're limited, definitely go for the calves to start, and then I would go in that order.
Yeah. And what we'll be doing is to everybody who signed up or registered for this, we're putting together a basketball introduction series for warm-up protocol. We'll send that out to you as well for the calf sleeves and the warm-up protocol for anybody who is interested. And just want to say thanks again. It was a great webinar. We've had a lot of questions, a lot of engagement, and we've gone on for a good conversation. JC, as always, thanks so much for, as I always say, putting the science into wearable. And Carl, thanks so much for your time in your, I know, busy schedule. And we'll be hearing more from you down the road. And most important, good luck with the season. Let's hope this NBA gets up and going. And to everybody out there, thanks so much. Grace and the team here for getting this off the ground. Be safe and be healthy. And we'll talk to everybody soon. And again, both of you, thanks so much.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Thanks, Joe. See you, Carl.
See you, John.
We'll talk soon, guys.